Well, the illustrious tenure of Jamie Harrison is coming to an end at the Democratic National Committee, which means this mess of a party now needs a new leader. Leaping at the opportunity to take on that thankless task is Ben Wikler, among other people. Ben is currently the chair of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. And look, anybody that comes on this show, I think, is already, in our minds, one of our favorites for the job. So Ben, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, so let's start with the question of the basic question. Why do you think Democrats lost, and what can Democrats do differently, and what is the DNC's role in facilitating that?
The big picture this year is that in every wealthy democracy around the world, left, right, and center parties lost votes. And when you look at who they lost, it's not concentrated among one ethnic group or one racial group or one gender or one geography. It is across the board. The biggest uniting thing is people who are the most affected by high prices. And the second thing, in my view, something that's much under-discussed, is that it's people who were the beneficiaries of support during the COVID pandemic that dramatically raised the income that people had, especially in the bottom end of the economic spectrum. And then that support went away. And so even though wages were growing more at the bottom end of the economic spectrum for the first time in a long time in the United States, thanks to a lot of policies that I strongly support, people's experience of how much money they had went down at the same time as prices went up. And the fury and frustration about that for folks who had to choose between filling a prescription or buying groceries, that led people to vote for something different. It's not an endorsement of Trump's plans or policies. The highest swing came among the people paying the least attention to political news. And the biggest swing towards the strongest support from Harris came from people who knew the most about her policies and Trump's. And what that tells us about what we have to do is that we have to mount a permanent campaign that actually breaks through and reaches people who are not paying attention to politics to make totally clear that we are fighting for them and what the other side plans to do to them, which is to rip them off in order to enrich a handful of the wealthiest people in the universe who are now peopling the Donald Trump incoming administration.
I mean, I think that's true. I think 2021 and 2022 kind of opened a window to people that said, oh, wait, you actually can have a better world. Like overnight, we cut child poverty in half. And Democrats were celebrating it. Look, we cut child poverty in half. It's like, wow, we can do that? Like we increased unemployment benefits such that people who lost their jobs had a little bit more breathing room as they were looking for a new work. And then we took it all away. So I think you're exactly right about that. But then what can Democrats do about that between now and the next election, and also in general?
Well, we know the biggest policy battle most likely for next year already, which is that the Trump administration, last time they were in, their one major signature legislative accomplishment was passing a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut for billionaires and giant corporations. And that expires next year. And so we know that there's going to be a huge fight in Congress over what should happen with those tax cuts and with that money. And we know that the Republicans across the board are going to try to shovel gigantic amounts of money that a lot of people could urgently benefit from instead to the people who already have the most. And Democrats can unite and fight back against that at every level in a way that makes absolutely clear whose side we're on and whose side the GOP is on in this moment. There's a lot of disagreements and it's a healthy thing within the Democratic coalition, but there is a united belief that we shouldn't be dismantling the support that the middle class and working class folks across this country rely on in order to enrich the already ultra wealthy. And that's a fight that we can wage that resonates across our whole coalition, and it will be in the center of the fight next year. So that my platform is Unite, Fight, Win. We're going to do that next year, and we've got to do that each year to show who we're for and who the Republicans are for, why they're trying to divide us in order to rip us off. I think if we do that, we're going to be able to make dramatic gains at the state level and local level and congressional level and build up towards a chance to win control of the government back in the 2028 elections.
And Ben, are there structural changes that need to happen when it comes to fundraising? Obviously, Democrats have benefited significantly from corporate money and from billionaires as well as Republicans. So would you commit to changing fundraising practices at the DNC, or does anything like that need to happen at the DNC so that the party becomes more or recentered with working class voters?
So I think the biggest thing for me is to win the political power to change the rules that affect everybody. And the second thing is, I think as Democrats, we should be clear about the big uniting values we fight for, which is including very much fighting for working people and fighting for the fundamental idea that everyone deserves freedom and respect. And folks can invest in that or not. And I hope that they do donate to that. But we're not going to shrink away from that kind of fight. We're not going to try to make a deal to give, half as many $1 trillion to billionaires in order to curry favor with folks who might decide to support the Republicans or Democrats if only Democrats would get on board with Trump's policies on this. I think we have to fight for what we're for and then enlist as much support as we can to build a winning coalition to make that happen.
And so your roots are really on the kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but the people who are voting on who becomes DNC chair, there are not a whole lot of people from that wing. So I'm curious, as you're kind of positioning yourself for DNC chair, like tell our viewers, like, who votes for DNC? What types of Democrats are those, and how does that shape how the DNC thinks about what it's going to do?
But my job before being the state party chair in Wisconsin was as the Washington, D.C. director at MoveOn. And at MoveOn, I was deeply involved in the fight against the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And then moved back to Wisconsin. When I ran for Wisdom's chair, I discovered a lot of the people voting in the electorate for chair of the state party were getting my emails at MoveOn, and they knew about that work. The members of the DNC, they represent the full kind of ideological coalition of the Democratic Party. But the central thing is that they believe in the Democratic Party as a force that can make positive change in people's lives. And that is a belief that I deeply share. And I know there's lots of critics left, right, and center. I think that the Democratic Party has been a driving force behind many of the biggest steps forward in our country's history. It is absolutely, there's lots of other moments that are in our history, but we need to build on those things that are good. And what I've done in Wisconsin, my pitch now is that I can help unite a party. We're going to be a big tent. We're not going to force out folks who identify as centrist or moderate, or folks who that was my coffee, folks who identify as progressive. We're going to find the big uniting values and fights that can bring us together. And in Wisconsin, there are Democrats running in different kinds of districts who have different views. Often, I think, to identify as a centrist means to say to voters who believe in a caricature of what the left believes in, no, I don't believe in that caricature. But centrist Democrats, progressive Democrats, everyone are going to be together in fighting against Trump's giant ripoff attempt next year and against his most extreme and awful nominees. There's a whole bunch of stuff that brings us together as a party, and we have to find the energy that comes from those kinds of fights in order to demonstrate what we're about.
And Ben, you and I are both from Wisconsin, but as someone on the right, I've been kind of fascinated by the debate swirling over whether or not the Kamala is for quote unquote they them ad that the Trump campaign ran over and over again in swing states actually was working. Is that something that significantly moved voters? There's some research that says it did move voters. So I'm curious, Ben, for your take on whether that ad was successful in states like Wisconsin, where obviously you oversaw Tammy Baldwin overperforming Kamala Harris. And Tammy Baldwin obviously openly gay. So there's something to that as well when we're considering the ad in question. So was that ad successful? If so, why? And what would you do to sort of combat messaging like that from Republicans in a way that helps Democrats win the war there?
Well, what's interesting is the states where that ad was being run the most are the states where the shift towards Trump were the least. Wisconsin had a shift of 1.5 points towards Trump relative to 2020. Nationwide, it was 6 points. Outside the battleground states, it was 6.7 points. So the places where Trump campaigned the hardest and Harris campaigned the hardest, Harris did better than the places where neither of them were campaigning. And we saw the same massive flood of anti-trans ads attacking Tammy Baldwin and down ballot Democrats. We flipped 14 state legislative seats, and Tammy Baldwin won her race. I think the central argument in that ad that I would guess did have some effect, and they ran a lot of tests of it, was an argument about whose side Tammy's on. Because she's for they, them, which is a bid to, I guess, non-binary phobia, not for you. It was an argument that she wants to spend money on people other than you. And that was it was trying to inflame division and fear. And at the same time, it was making an economic argument that she's not focused on your priorities and fighting for people like you. And this is a context where Democrats lost people making under $50,000 a year. So there's a cultural message, but the central big message that Trump was trying to win with was, I'll bring down your prices. I won't do taxes on tips. I'm going to do all this stuff. And for Democrats, puncturing that and showing that, in fact, Trump is completely against working people. He's the guy who smashes unions and wants to fire people who are striking. He's the guy who wants to carve up the federal government and give handouts to people with hundreds of billions of dollars in their bank accounts. That argument can puncture those kinds of appeals to division that are fundamentally about othering some community in order to make voters feel like Democrats would put them in an outgroup. And I think we need to be able to narrate and explain why they're doing that and then punch back. And we have won a lot of races in the face of those attacks up and down the ballot in the state of Wisconsin. We can do the same thing nationwide.
Our colleague Crystal has made an interesting point about that ad, which I agree with, which is that, and actually flows out of your point, that it was the "he's for you" part of it that probably landed harder than the previous part. But the idea that Democrats care about other stuff, like they're not serious about taking care of your needs here domestically. And I think there's a counterintuitive kind of connection to Democratic foreign policy there as well. Like, I feel like the amount of energy and time, forget the money, but the money matters too, but the amount of focus on the war in Ukraine and also the Israeli genocide going on in Gaza, plus that, which then, unspooled into this regional conflict, beginning really in October, the worst possible time for the Biden-Harris team, deliberately so, I'm sure, from Netanyahu's perspective. But as voters see Biden focusing so much on things overseas, the wars overseas, it feeds into that perception that Democrats care about things other than what's going on here, to me, at this moment. So I'm curious for you, what role do you think the kind of more militaristic approach that Democrats took, bringing Liz Cheney onto the stage with them
in Wisconsin,
really solidified that idea that this is the thing that we care about. Do you think that hurt Democrats?
So I know that others disagree with me on this. I don't think it hurt Democrats. And I will say that the counties where we actually increased not just the number of Democratic votes, but actually increased the margins were the suburbs of Milwaukee. They moved towards Democrats this year, while the rest of the country and the rest of the state moved a little bit in Wisconsin and a lot nationally towards Trump. And the question is, which message wound up landing the most? You have to be a pretty tuned-in voter to think about foreign policy when you see Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris on stage talking about democracy and talking about how across the spectrum we think that Trump is a disaster. Now, you have to be a fairly tuned-in voter to be thinking about democracy too. It's not a message that if you're trying to figure out how to not lose the place where you put your kids to bed at night because the cost of housing is so high, you're probably not thinking about the erosion of democratic norms. So this is a message that was fine-tuned towards voters who were still trying to make up their minds, who had misgivings about Trump. But from the evidence that I can see, it did move those voters. At the same time, your broader point that a lot of Trump's argument against the foreign policy of the Biden administration and of previous Republicans is fundamentally about, this is all about other people elsewhere, and we should be focused on right here. That's the kind of core of America first. And that is a potent argument, especially when people are in economic pain. And I think that for Democrats, centering the fight of the moment on actually being on people's side, understanding their struggles and fighting to change it, and explaining why it's so hard, why it's so expensive. The fact that every single Republican voted against trying to extend the child tax credit, for example, and voted against support for childcare and against support for housing. All these things, every Republican voted against them, and a couple of Democrats weren't ready to go along. But there's overwhelming near unanimity, and I think in this Congress could be unanimity around a set of priorities that actually do go directly to people's lived experience and struggle. I'm a believer that people vote, as Kellyanne Conway said, who I don't agree with on much. Fundamentally, people vote on what affects them, not what offends them. And I think when you look at a lot of the Republican ads and messaging, you think it's about something that offends you, but it's actually a way of saying Democrats are focused on a thing that offends you, and they're not focused on what affects you. And for Democrats, our strongest argument against that is to fight about the things that affect people in a way that provokes a reaction from the Republicans to make clear whose side they're on. if they are out there trying to protect the rights of the ultra wealthy to smash Social Security and to break apart the supports that allow people to have a middle class life and be able to support their kids, if Republicans are defending that terrible policy and we're on offense, then that makes clear what the battle lines are. And that's why it's so critical that we engage in these fights, as we did in the healthcare fight that became the defining issue of 2018, because we fought so hard in 2017 against the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That changes what an election is about. And that, to me, is a key role for the Democratic Party. It is to help define and narrate where the battle lines are in a way where the large majority of the country actually wants a country that works for working people. And as chair, I focus on building infrastructure in every state, figuring out the critical fights we need to have, making sure we have the people and the resources to do them, and then leaning into those fights that bring the majority of the country together against people who are trying to rip off almost everyone else.
And one of the reasons I think your bid is so compelling to people is that the Wisconsin Democratic Party was, let me put this in a charitable way, sort of a mess in the Scott Walker years, sort of wandering in the wilderness in the Scott Walker years. But what was always interesting about the Scott Walker years is that Wisconsin isn't exactly a purple state. It's a pretty blue state. And these kind of Tea Party era austerity messages were for some reason attractive to Wisconsin voters, not just at the top of the gubernatorial ticket, but down ballot in races, assembly races, state Senate races around the state for a number of years, almost a decade. And I guess I'm curious, Ben, what lessons you took from bringing the Democratic Party of Wisconsin out of the wilderness after the Scott Walker era. Why were those policies so attractive to Wisconsin voters at that time? And how did Democrats sort of rebuild and repitch their message after that era?
So I agree with you that I think there's a kind of beating blue heart, or a heart that is at the root of the progressive movement is in Wisconsin. And there's also a far right strain in Wisconsin. The John Birch Society is based in Appleton, and Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy came from Wisconsin. And both Wisconsins exist. They're always in contention for political power in the state. We saw this zigzag where Obama won a massive landslide in 2008. Scott Walker won big in 2010. Obama won again, and Tammy Baldwin in 2012. Scott Walker won again in 2014. In 2016, what we saw was the culmination of what Walker and Republicans did in all those years, which is to rig the state to break our democracy. They gerrymandered the living daylights out of our legislative districts. They suppressed voting rights. They smashed unions. They defunded public education and public services. They used every tool they could to try to undermine the basis of worker power and of people power and of an educated citizenry and all of the things that allow what the public wants to be expressed through their votes and turn into public policy. And that culminated in 2016 when Trump won the state. He was the first Republican to win the state of Wisconsin since 1988. Now, that said, it was also a very close year, and Wisconsin elections are close over and over. 5 of the last 7 presidential races in Wisconsin have come down to less than 1 percentage point. So the thing for me has been to work with our whole coalition, with our amazing allies and local activists all over the state, and say, we need a permanent campaign that organizes in every corner of the state of Wisconsin, that builds trusted local communicators to communicate with their own communities, door-to-door, neighbor-to-neighbor organizing campaigns that operate year-round, and not just in the big elections, but also things like state Supreme Court races, which, to make this vivid, we just had an election. We're gearing up for a state Supreme Court race this spring, April 1st. Susan Crawford, a judge who defended Planned Parenthood in court and has defended workers' rights, against Brad Schimmel, who was Scott Walker's attorney general and helped lead the fight against the Affordable Care Act, for abortion bans, for gerrymandering, defended that in court, supported Act 10 and terrible anti-worker policies. That fight is gearing up right now, and we have an organizing team right now pulling together the voter universes, making the plans. We'll be knocking on doors in freezing cold in the winter this year. And it's by winning those fights that we've been able to unrig the legislative maps that allowed us to flip 14 state legislative seats this November. I think there are Susan Crawfords and Brad Schimmels running for offices no one's ever heard of nationwide. And that, to me, is what the Democratic Party nationally should partner with state parties and local parties around the country to lean into those battles, because those have enormous up-ballot consequences and can help tip presidential elections. If you make sure that the rules actually empower people to have a voice, then you can stop those who want to put our democracy in chains from being able to rig the system to ensure that they stay in power.
And I wanted to ask you about one of the more high-profile things that you've been criticized about by some party activists, and that is ballot access during the 2024 presidential election. Dean Phillips kind of sued the Wisconsin party, which you're the chair of, in order to get on the ballot. And some party activists have said that you and the Wisconsin Democratic Party were too closed off and made it too hard, for people to get on the ballot, and that's anti-democratic and so on. Now, I personally don't think that this issue will be relevant in the DNC race, because I think DNC delegates don't care about that. I think that's a different problem. I think they should care about it, but I think the party insiders who are going to choose this are probably all on the side of following the rules. And if Dean Phillips doesn't follow the rules, screw him. But I wanted you to give your perspective and your counter to this criticism that the Wisconsin Democratic Party kind of unfairly kept people off the ballot, and that Joe Biden really needed a challenge, and that the lack of a challenge to him was one of the things that undermined Democrats when it came to the final election results.
So in Wisconsin, there's two ways on the presidential ballot if you're running in a Democratic or Republican primary. The first is that the party, which had long before endorsed Joe Biden, can put the names of candidates on the ballot at a meeting that's held. And then the second, which my team explained to Dean Phillips' campaign manager, is that you can go and collect 8,000 signatures from your supporters to get you on the ballot. And you have a period to do that. And we collect many, many times that number of signatures for ballot access. We're in the midst of doing that right now for local candidates who will get on the ballot for school board and city council races. That work happens in winter in Wisconsin every single year, because every spring there's a spring election. And the Phillips campaign decided not to do any organizing. I don't know if they had supporters they could have asked to go and stand outside a grocery store and ask people to sign the nomination papers. But this is a matter of course for almost everyone who gets on the ballot for every office in the state of Wisconsin. And they chose not to do it. And instead they decided to go to court and then launch a media campaign to say that this was the big party stomping out their right to get on the ballot and run for president. They wound up getting 16,000 votes. They did worse than Ron DeSantis in Wisconsin, who dropped out a long time before on the Republican side. Ultimately, to me, I think you have to be able to demonstrate and build support and do some organizing if you want to run for president of the United States or just about any office. So I hear the criticism, but to me, there was a very clear path that my team made clear to the campaign that they chose not to take, and have decided instead to launch a media campaign about it.
Once they launched the media campaign, why not just fold and put them on? Like, all right, fine. And why not why didn't the party just put him on in that meeting? Because it was clear he was running, or maybe he wasn't running by then. I don't know.
He was. I mean, they reached out and asked about what the process was. We explained that process. They sent a letter about their candidacy. They didn't literally ask. I'm sure they would have liked us to put them on the ballot. We had an extensive message with a very clear ask from the Biden campaign. But fundamentally, if you're going to challenge a sitting president, you should have a campaign that builds a capacity to do that. And we, the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, had endorsed Joe Biden, and the opportunity for them was right there in the law. They didn't launch the media campaign until they launched the lawsuit the day before the filing deadline for those signatures. So I was honestly a little bit baffled. I thought that was the period where they were collecting signatures, and instead that was when they were preparing their lawsuit. But that is how it went down. There are different rules in different states, but in Wisconsin, there's a very clear path for people who want to challenge, want to get on the ballot, even if a party didn't put them there. And this is something that, for decades has been the practice. When there's an incumbent president, the party puts that candidate on, and other people, go collect some signatures if they want to get on the ballot.
I guess if Emily doesn't have anything else, last question for me would be, and some news that is breaking this morning, Third Way endorsed your bid for DNC chair. From my perspective, that's kind of shocking. I feel like that should disqualify you. But then on the other hand, Third Way has taken some really interesting positions over the last couple of years. They've been supportive of the child tax credit. They've been supportive of a lot of kind of social spending, and even said nice things about Bernie Sanders. You and I, 20 years ago, we remember Third Way being a mortal enemy. And probably said some pretty vicious things about you back when you were at Move On. What the heck's going on here? How did you wind up with Third Way's support, and why shouldn't this just kind of rule you out of contention as far as progressives are concerned?
Well, my argument is unite, fight, win, and uniting means bringing a whole bunch of people together to fight fights that we can agree on, that I think spell out the core difference between what Republicans are about in this era and what Democrats can and should be about in this era. If you read the op-ed, I read it this morning, they made the argument that I represent. I'm from the Midwest. I see how campaigns actually happen in a place that's incredibly, contentious and where Republicans throw everything they can and we fight back and we're able to win more often than we lose. They argue that I'm from a new generation and I think seriously about how we communicate, where we communicate. I'm here with you right now. I have a background in new media. There's a lot that we need to do to retool how we reach people who do not trust mainstream media sources or don't tune into political news. And that's something that's non-ideological but critical for victory. And then their last point is that I recognize that there will be candidates in different places in the ideological spectrum, and I believe in a big tent. And I do. I think that, I was talking to the chair of the Louisiana Democratic Party last night, and how you win in Louisiana is very different from how you win in Vermont or lots of different places. But there are some core values that are fundamentally the same across all those places. And I'll go back to where I started this interview. Democrats believe that our economy should work for working people. And there's some debates about exactly how to do that. But that is a fundamental core belief for this party. And we believe everyone is worthy of freedom and dignity and respect, that is just a fundamental value. And making that case, often with different language in different places, there'd be different messengers who are more trusted in different places than others, finding ways to puncture the right-wing caricature of what it means to be a Democrat. That work plays out differently in different parts of the country. But fighting for those fundamental values is actually uniting victorious proposition. And when voters clearly hear what it is that we are actually fighting for, they do respond. And I think we have to get a lot better at making those battle lines clear and making clear who we're for, which is the many in this country. The vast majority of Americans do much better when Democrats are able to set these policies. If we can do that, then I think we're going to be able to win sweeping, like many, many, many elections down ballot in 25, 6, 7, 8. And we can end this era of pretty frightening kind of mega extreme authoritarian attacks and plutocracy. That is the ultimate reason why people are backing those attacks. We can end this over the next 4 years. And there'll be a lot of challenging fights in the middle, but we've got to do this work.
And I guess just last question, and just quickly, I'm just curious personally, because of the work you've done in Wisconsin, bringing that party back to life, you can kind of punch your own ticket in the party. People have talked about you as a potential senator or governor, cool jobs. Becoming DNC chair, if you actually do it, probably sets you back from any of those ambitions, because DNC chairs are not generally popular. So what are you thinking? Like, why go for this job?
I am drawn to this job because the stakes of this job are so enormous. And I think this is a time when I hope a whole lot of people are running into the fire. I think the stakes for the rest of our lives, the rest of our kids' lives, the rest of the lives of all the people in this entire country are going to be affected by what happens in these next 4 years. And trying to contain the damage and also fight back in a way that builds strength for Democrats and for people who believe in democracy and in an economy that works for everyone. Over these next 4 years, we can win trifectas in states that are out of reach right now. We can break Republican trifectas. We can break Republican supermajorities in states like North Carolina, where they just won this critical state Supreme Court race, and now Republicans are trying to throw out tens of thousands of votes. We can make changes that will affect people's lives in every corner of the country, including in my state, in Wisconsin. And that, to me, I'm drawn to this job just for one reason, which is the impact that we can have together if we unite and fight these fights. I think that if we can win, ultimately the only measure of politics is the impact that it has on people's lives. That's the thing you have to work backwards from when you're deciding what to do. And if you think that the stakes are as high as I think they are, I think that the opportunity to work with folks in every state across this country with the Democratic Party at this moment is the highest impact thing we can do to try to create that change that people desperately need.
All right. Well, that's Ben Wikler, chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, candidate for DNC chair. If you're watching this and your name is Ken Martin or your name is Rahm Emanuel, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have you on as well. No favorites here at Counterpoints. But Ben, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.